All right, so today we are kind of a transition point during the semester. We are transitioning from the first half in which or I guess most of the semester involves looking at the ethical questions that come up from cyber technology. So the questions inherent in it. So things like security risks, hacking, all the sorts of stuff we've been talking about for the past, I don't know, 7, 8 classes. The final few weeks are going to look bigger picture. And they're, instead of asking the questions inherent in tech, they're going to be looking at bigger picture questions of what are the ethical implications of cyber technology and how dominant it is in the world? And also, what are some of the ways in which cyber technology has interacted with the sorts of questions that ethicists have been concerned with for a long time, things like equality, things like racism. So that's what we're going to be talking about for the next few classes. Business point, papers are all graded, and in my book, I just want to look over them one more time just to make sure I didn't make any crazy big mistakes. Every once in a while, my brain goes out to lunch, and instead of writing A, I write C. And so I just want to make sure I didn't do any of that. All right, so this is the question that's at the core of the next few weeks, is simply put, has cyber tech made the world better? Or has it actually made the world a better place? So, simply put, what are people's thoughts on this? I want to open this up. There's not a right or wrong answer, and I think both sides are correct. But just generally speaking, when we approach it from an ordinary way, has cyber technology made the world a better place? If you think yes, why? Or what are some ways in which it's made it a better place? If no, what are some of those reasons? And then I'm going to use this as our jumping off point for what we're going to be talking about for the next few classes. So, what are people's thoughts? Has cyber technology improved the world? And if so, how? And if not, how not?
Yes, communication, infrastructure.
So say a little more, Rodney.
We're able to communicate all across the globe. Space, satellites, I don't know.
Global communication. So what is the advantage of this? Why do we like global communication? What does it give us?
Easier access to communicate with other countries, clear up mistakes.
Talk to other nations. So nations can talk to each other more easily and not, it used to be the case that you'd have to send an envoy or a diplomat across the world. Now, if you do something that another nation doesn't like, you just call them on the phone or shoot them a text. World leaders have each other's phone numbers. They can do this. What are some other reasons we like global communication? What are the advantages of that?
Professor,
yeah.
I don't know if it's related to communication, but I wanted to add also like the health, health industry, medical technology. Like the work they can do now with cancer and major other diseases. And
yeah, just like think about how quickly we got a vaccine for COVID up and running. It took less than a year, in large part because of things like computer modeling. Because of the speed with which modern technology allows communication, we were able to get the vaccine out in 6 months. That is a big improvement over what it was in the past, Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. And like also teams of scientists, they don't necessarily need to be in the same room to work, together.
That's another great point, is we can have scientists around the world sharing their research. It used to be that if you had, a group of scientists working in the United States, they couldn't just call up their friends in, I don't know, Russia or China or Switzerland and be like, hey, what are you finding? What are your discoveries? So there can be communication amongst researchers. The research itself is using these technologies in ways that are genuinely saving people's lives. So those are very positive things. What are some other reasons either that we like the benefits of global communication or other benefits of cyber technology? The ways you can be informed of what's going on. Informed. So it used to be the case that really you couldn't know what was going on other parts of the world except maybe what was written on your newspaper that you got. But before that, not everyone was reading the newspaper. Nowadays, if you want to know what is going on anywhere in the world, if you put in the effort, you can find out. If you want to know how many people live in a certain place, you can know. If you want to follow step for step what is happening in the coup in Myanmar right now, you can follow that. You can understand the implications that has. If you want to follow the nationalist risings in India and the conflicts that are going on between the government and farmers, you can look that up. Also, so that is also, you can be informed because of this global communication. Another one, how many of you have seen your grandparents in the past year? Physically, face to face? Anyone who lives with their grandparents or sees them regularly? How about those of you who haven't seen your grandparents? Have you still been able to talk to them?
Yeah, I have talked to them. Not see them in over a year since the pandemic.
A lot of people haven't seen their grandparents in over a year, and yet you're still able to talk to them. And Jorge, how were you able to do it?
I called them. Like, we use WhatsApp because they're out of the country.
Yeah, you can use WhatsApp. You can stay in touch with family members around the world. You don't lose contact with people. 200 years ago, if you left your home nation and came to the United States, when were you next going to talk to your family who didn't come with you?
The next time you travel to visit them.
Yeah, exactly. You had to go there. And very often, the people who came to the United States were not wealthy people. And the plan was, it was a one-way trip. If you were saying goodbye to your family, you were saying goodbye to your family. My great-grandmother left Poland when she was 18 and didn't see her parents again, ever. Just because she wasn't able to travel back. And so nowadays, our families can stay connected from halfway around the world. You see something funny, you want to connect with your grandmother who lives halfway around the globe, you can do it. So it also allows us to stay in touch. And all of this is through the communications. Now, what are some other things, either positive or negative? We've had all these positive things. Can anybody think of any of the negative problems? Yeah, so some of the negative things is we now have the things we were talking about the last few classes, things like threats and anonymity. Just the nature of communication has changed. We can talk to people around the world, but a lot of the things we were talking about, it's not simply that the tech raises these questions, it's rather that it has led to more problems. There are more violent discussions going on now than there ever were before, simply because more people are talking. What are some other negatives or positives that people can think of?
A lot of our secure data is like easier to access.
Yeah, because communication is so much more on the same side, data is easier to access, which in some ways, our technology makes us safer in certain ways with medical and everything else, but it can also make us more at risk, physically at risk. We can have our information stolen like ever before. You have to worry about your credit card number being stolen. Used to be the only way you could steal a credit card number is you literally broke in somewhere and stole the piece of paper it was written on, or you stole the physical card. Nowadays, your data is out there. It's much easier to access. What are some other bigger picture things? Sorts of worries, either worries or positives. Here's another, let's talk about on this side. We say global communication is easier. We can talk to each other. Is that always a good thing? Is it always good that we're able to talk to everyone?
Yeah, Professor, I was going to say that for every positive, there is a negative. Like, yeah, every positive can be a negative too at the same time.
Yeah, so what are some of the negatives of the fact that we can communicate constantly? Part of it is that our information can be taken from us. Khalid, what do you mean by social isolation here? I think you're onto something. I just want to see, I just don't want to put words into your mouth.
I mean, when you like just don't meet face to face.
Yeah,
just everything goes to
no face to face. So over the past year, we've had a very little amount of face-to-face interactions. We have been doing things mostly by Zoom. Has anyone else just found this incredibly depressing to not be able to do things like hug your friends, or be able to do things like just see another person and see their lips moving, and you're not in the same space all the time? Like, we're really has anyone had this experience of just like, it is incredibly lonely. The past year has been lonely, and you're tired of seeing the same four walls and the same family members and maybe a few other people, but you can't go out, you can't meet new people. And so there's even stuff like, biologically speaking, we evolved to deal with human contact. Things like hugs release neurotransmitters in your body, which improve your mood. Things like communication, as we talked about the last class, it's much easier to miscommunicate when you can't see someone else's facial expression. So while you can communicate more generally, it's also much easier to get misunderstandings. What are some of the other positives or negatives of it? Misinformation. And this is really one we're going to be talking about in a couple classes, of the way in which, because it's so much easier to communicate, it's also much easier to spread things like fake news and misinformation. And people are now able, because of the nature of technology, governments are able to engage in propaganda campaigns like never before. You're able, on the one hand, even though you have more access to information and be more informed, it's also much easier for other people to misinform you and get you to think what they want, simply because of the way in which misinformation can spread. What else? Also tied in kind of with misinformation or with people talking to you. How many of you have been laying in bed at night, and you just want to go to bed, and all of a sudden you hear that ding on your email, and all of a sudden it's 10:45, and all of a sudden, instead of falling asleep, you're responding to an email?
It basically messes up sleep because like apparently blue light like a lot doesn't allow you to sleep correctly. Like it just puts you like more awake, I guess.
Yeah, so one thing is there's actual physical effects of the blue light from a screen on your body. But even if the light wasn't a problem,
Addiction.
yeah, there's addiction elements. There's lots of negative things where like these programs are designed to get us addicted to them, to get us to keep spending time on these pieces of technology. So in this particular case also, 100 years ago, if you wanted to be left alone, what could you do? If your boss wanted to get a hold of you on a Saturday,
Say you don't have your phone on you, or it was off, and then you just stay there. But now everybody's so online that you can't hide. And now you either have things like, oh, you have to respond. You have no like break time. You might have overtime. You might have cancel culture. People showing up to your house. And then also it's just more physical endangerment because you can be found like pretty much because your information is online.
Yeah, so you covered about 6 things, Marcus. So I'm not going to write them all down because I'm running out of space. But one of them is back to this, because data is easier to access, in some ways you are more at risk if somebody wants to find you. If somebody wants to know where you live, they can do that easily. If somebody wants to know who your family is, they can do that easily. So there's this lack. On the one hand, there's more anonymity, which leads to problems. On another hand, there's less anonymity because you can always be found. Another issue here is this thing of, we can't ever get away anymore. We need to relax our minds to just be able to shut off and not think about other things. We are a species that needs relaxation time. And because of this, with modern technology, it's harder and harder and harder to come by. So while on the one hand, we have new ways to do entertainment, things like Netflix, video games, texting with our friends from far away, the flip side of that is that also means that your boss can always get a hold of you. And because your boss can always get a hold of you, there's this expectation that you should always respond. Nowadays, if I get an email on Friday at 8 p.m., there's this expectation that I'm going to respond to it over the weekend, because it's just built in that that is what a professor needs to do to ensure that everyone's on the same page. And so if you aren't doing that, there ends up being an issue. Are there any others that people want to talk about? Any other sorts of issues in terms of cyber making the world better or worse places? The ones that we're going to talk about today have not totally come up yet. So I'm going to direct us in that direction shortly, but I want to make sure that everyone said their piece on their own sorts of concerns or the benefits of technology.
Professor, I wanted to say something more general.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have this society that is actually very unequal. You know, there is very, I mean, the level of inequality is so great that we thought that maybe technology was gonna bridge, make that gap smaller. But I think through the pandemic, we see that it's actually not. I don't know if it has like become greater, but it hasn't decreased the level of inequality.
I'm really glad you, Jorge, you just made my transition for me. This is what we're going to talk about now, is equality and inequality with technology. Because the question is, one of the things in the world we like is certain types of equality. And we want a world that is more equal in certain ways. And we have been told over and over again that technology is making the world a more equal place. But is it actually leading to more equality, or is it leading to inequality? And so that's what we're going to talk about here. So first off, let me just erase these, because let me write down Ibrahima's point here of job replacements. So before we start talking about the ways in which the internet and modern technology has made things equal versus unequal or unequal, I want to take the time to actually discuss what we mean by equality when we're talking about it. Because we use the word equality very generally, but there's really many different ways in which things can be equal or not equal. And there's only some of them we like, and some of them we don't like. So equality versus inequality. When we're talking about equality, and we talk about the type of equality we like, what do we mean by that? What sort of equality do we want in society? And what types of equality do we not care about? Jorge.
Yeah, for me, Professor, a major one is like the opportunities that people get, you know, while becoming like adults and growing up and all that.
So yeah, so the main way in which we talk about equality and what we want is we want equality of opportunity. What does it mean to talk about equality of opportunity? Because there are other types of equality we don't care about. So I'm just going to put up equality we care about and equality we don't. So the biggest one we do care about is equality of opportunity. So what does that mean? What does equality of opportunity mean? Well, in some sense, well, does anyone want to try to give a stab at it? What does one mean when we talk about equality of opportunity?
It's basically giving the same chances to everybody, no matter like what race, gender, or everything. And I always thought it was actually the other way around, where like people wanted well, I guess like people did want opportunity, but there's also the equality that people want everything to be the same. So if you had the same job, you should get the same money. But then there's a whole bunch of issues like, but say like you have a lazy worker versus a hard worker, and then you change the pay on that, right? Or you negotiated a deal and other stuff.
So that's exactly the thing. So there's a type of equality we want. We want equal opportunity. We also want equal rewards for same amount of effort. So Marcus just brought up a type we don't care about. We don't really want just straight equal income levels. we don't just want it to be the case that everyone makes the same amount of money, regardless of what they do and regardless of how hard they work. Everyone could get paid, $50,000 a year if they're a doctor, if they're a lawyer, if they don't work. That these are the sorts of things we don't necessarily as a society want that level of inequality, because there's a sense of like, if I'm working really hard and you're not doing anything, you shouldn't get the same amount of money that I do. Or this is the famous group projects issue. If I do all the work on a group project and my partners do nothing, then the fact that they get an A and I get an A seems somehow unfair. What other types of equality don't we necessarily care about?
Professor, I'm sorry, I was thinking about something else that just came
Oh, no,
back
no,
to
go
me.
for it, go for it. Lead ahead.
Because like I was reading that the middle class here, like before the 70s, was maybe had the highest paying rate like in the world, even for in Europe, now that we talk about Europe a lot. And after all this technology, like came to be, and all these major companies and corporations started to see that they could make more money by outsourcing all the jobs. So instead of paying us, let's say by the dollar, they could pay you by the cent, and they outsource this to Brazil, India, China. So I was thinking about that, Professor, like, because this is really minor problem, that a lazy worker versus a worker that works harder. But this is a major issue, where
Yes,
you
so
outsource everything.
this is exactly the sort of big picture question that I'm going to get into. So I'm going to save that point of outsourcing and everything else, and the ways in which technology ties in with that, and how these issues are coming together in a moment, because I think outsourcing and the way in which a more connected world allows for, in some sense, more equality of opportunity to work on these jobs, but on the flip side, less equality in terms of overall income level. So I think another type of equality we care about is just like overall wealth to a degree. So there's a sense in which we don't want to have some people who, like, you don't want one person to have all the money and everyone else to have nothing. In a sense, that somehow feels wrong to us, either because of fairness or just because a society that's organized like that doesn't succeed, because the one person has all the control and all the power. And what we find is this level of wealth to a degree is tied in with the equality of opportunity. So when we're talking about equality, these are the sorts of things we have in mind. We don't care about how much you make as a flat rate. We want it more tied to how much work you're doing. Or we also want it that no matter where you're from or what your background is, you have the same chances to succeed. We don't generally in a society care about equality in things like height, or equality in things like eye color. We don't think that everyone needs to have the same eye color or the same height. Those things can be unequal and we don't care. We care much more about opportunity. We also don't care that everyone looks the same or eats the same. We want some inequality in our lives. We just want certain types of equality. Most importantly, equality of opportunity. So everyone knows then what we mean by equality of opportunity. It's the idea of you want everyone to start at the same place. You don't want some people to have an advantage. It's like in a sporting game. You don't want one team to start ahead by a whole bunch of points or by a whole bunch of goals, because that's not going to be in some sense fair. And if the goal of a society is to function well and to do as good as possible, you want to make sure that everyone starts at the same place so that the most talented people are able to rise to the top. So if one person starts with no opportunity, it doesn't matter how smart they are, how hard they work. If somebody else starts way ahead of them, then in some sense, they've already lost before the game's begun. If you're playing basketball and you start down 50 points, even if you're Michael Jordan, you're not going to beat a first grader. In the same way, if we don't have equality of opportunity, then if you're one of the people who starts in some sense already at a disadvantage, you're never going to be able to succeed. and achieve the things that other people are able to do without as much talent as you, or without as much hard work as you. And so this is the sort of equality we really care about, this notion of equality of opportunity. And I think the question then we can ask is, has cyber technology improved equality of opportunity, or has it decreased equality of opportunity? And there's really not a clear answer to this. So let's talk about helped equality of opportunity and hurt equality of opportunity. So what are some of the ways in which it has helped our equality of opportunity? And by it, I mean cyber technology. And what are some of the ways it's hurt? Jorge, where do you think outsourcing should be put? Because I think it's kind of tough here on this one. There's a certain sense in which it could go under either, but I think I know which way we're leaning. Go ahead.
For me, it would be heard. For me, it'd be heard clearly, because you basically decimated a whole like group of people that were making like livable wages, you know, and then they just outsource all those jobs. So for me, it's negative.
Yeah, so here's the idea with does everyone know what we mean by outsourcing? What is
Basically
outsourcing?
using another country's workforce instead of our own.
Yeah, the basic idea is instead of having people working in the United States to create things, we instead are a US company. So we're based in, that's a beautiful map of the United States. So instead of using US workers to make your products, you instead, even though you, the CEO, live here and your company's registered here, you instead have all the things made over here in Vietnam. Now, why is it that companies outsource? What is the reason behind it?
It makes everything cheaper.
Yeah, Professor.
Yeah, it's
also,
cheaper.
the workforce organized, and they were very successful, like through the 40s, 50s, 60s, to create unions. So these companies were actually forced to pay you and raise your wages.
Yeah. So the fact is, why?
Yeah, Professor. And then these countries, these third world countries, where the society was very exploitative towards the poorest people, so they took advantage of that. They had no rights, workers or unions.
That's exactly it. So in the United States, after World War II, there was a lot of money to go around. There was a lot of wages. There was a lot being produced. So because of this, and because of the nature of technology at the time, it made more sense to create things here in the United States. And not only that, it ended up being the case that when you were paying a worker, so I'm just going to use modern salaries here to demonstrate this. So in the United States, say it's like the equivalent of modern salary. So I'm not going to use their money then numbers, but rather now, if you were creating a manufacturing job, so you wanted to make toys or puzzles, you'd pay a worker, say $20 an hour. And the reason you could pay that worker $20 an hour is if you didn't pay them this amount, they wouldn't work for you. And you didn't really have another choice because there were strong labor unions that would work together in unison to stop anyone from working at less than $20. So the company would have to pay you $20 per hour as a worker. However, as the world became smaller, thanks in large part to modern technology and shipping and communication and this sort of thing, what companies realized is there are many places elsewhere in the world where people did not have a lot of money. So over here in Vietnam, the average person was making, say, $1 an hour. Therefore, if you are working in Vietnam, because the country is incredibly unequal after the Vietnam War, there were a lot of things going on. And so what ended up happening is this company, because they could now communicate around the world, was able to go, hey, before we had to go with US workers and pay them $20. But now, because we can outsource things, because we can communicate with other nations, we can now produce the same exact goods and pay our workers. You know, in Vietnam, if the average person makes $1, then all you have to do is pay $1.50. And now you, as the company, are saving every toy you make. Say it takes an hour to make a toy, used to cost you $20, and now it costs you $1.50. Well, that means that you now have $18.50 less that you're paying per toy to then produce. So then what you're able to do is sell your toy then for say $16. And now you as a company are going to make a ton of money. And the only reason this is now possible is because of the interconnectedness of the world. So on the one hand, you as the consumer are going to pay less per toy, but that also means that there's going to be fewer jobs going to citizens of your nation. And rather what it means is that, if you take the world as a whole, more and more people are going to be working for lower and lower and lower salaries, because each person who used to get paid $20 is now a person elsewhere who's getting paid $1.50. And so just the very nature of the interconnectedness that's come with outsourcing has led to this general pull down of the poorest workers taken worldwide. And now on the flip side, if you own a company and you are able to outsource, what do your salaries and profits look like?
Professor, they increase, right? Because
Yeah.
one of the tenets of our economic system is to save on production, right? To save as much as. But Professor, isn't that like a catch-22 from what I was reading, that article? Then you take away your population's purchasing power, and eventually we have this society.
Yeah, so, and here's the issue, is that if you end up, so what's happened in the United States over the past 50 years is the wealthiest people have got much wealthier, while the lower classes have gotten, if you look at the sheer numbers, have gotten wealthier, but not at nearly the same rate as the wealthiest. And the reason why is because the wealthiest people are able to now get jobs, or are able to outsource, so that the people at the top who own the companies and the CEOs and those sorts of people whose salaries depend directly on how much money is going into the company as opposed to being paid a yearly salary. So for instance, if you're the CEO of Walmart, you aren't getting paid a flat salary. It's rather you get paid based on how well the company does because of things like bonuses and because of things like stock options. So when you get given a percentage of the company, and so as the company does better in terms of profits, you make more money. So because of that, what ends up happening is that the very top level people end up making more and more money because they are paying the workers that are producing the products less. So therefore they get more profit. But the workers on the whole, their salaries are staying rather stable. So if it used to be the case that the CEO used to have, say, $1 million, and now the CEO has $1 billion, then if you went from 50K to 100K, your comparison to this billionaire is so much less just in terms of percentage wise. You have gone up twice. They've gone up 1,000 times. So now all of a sudden this person with the $1 billion has much more, as Jorge put it, purchasing power than you in proportion, because what purchasing power is a way of thinking, how much of the economy do you personally have the ability to control or interact with? So does everyone understand that general mechanism of how the nature of the connectedness of the world has led to outsourcing in ways that have led to this income inequality between the richest people and the poorest people, or even the richest people and the middle class people, or even the richest people and we'd still call them rich, but they really aren't compared to the wealthiest that rich.
Oh, sorry, Jorge.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was thinking,
Market.
like how it's helped is like it's given people to work in other countries, I guess.
Yeah.
Like some people just don't just want to live in another place, and they can work there maybe.
Work remote. So one thing that it has helped is it used to be the case that the only people who got to work from home or got to it used to be that you would have to move somewhere And it was only if you were wealthy enough to have multiple houses that you could live far away. So there is now something with work remotely. It also does mean one thing that outsourcing has done is it has created jobs in other places. Now, the worry is that the jobs it's created have unfairly low wages, but there is an element in which the connectedness has allowed people worldwide who didn't used to work before to be able to engage in this work. So there is an element in which outsourcing, like, it's not entirely 100% bad. If you are somebody who didn't have a job before, and now all of a sudden Apple opens a factory in your town in China, now all of a sudden you could get a job. So I don't want to say that it's all 100% there's no benefits to outsourcing. There's certainly for the people who are doing the outsourcing, but even for the workers, there's some. It's just that if you compare the worker 50 years ago and how much they were making to how much a worker makes in a place where salaries are incredibly low, that person has a job, but that job is not the sort of wage that you would consider fair to the amount of work they're doing. Like if you were working in a factory all day and you get paid $2 a day, something feels not right if the person who owns the company is making $12 billion a year. Jorge.
So sometimes it's even considered, sometimes it's so bad that it's like considered a slave labor, Professor.
Yes, and here's another issue with it, which is that while we do have the ability to know what's going on around the world, in a lot of cases, people turn a blind eye for points of profit. So one of the other downsides of outsourcing is here in the United States, there are laws in place around labor. Usually when jobs are outsourced to other nations, those nations generally don't have the sorts of rules in place governing labor laws. So in the United States, there's a minimum salary. In other places, there's not. Also, even if there is a minimum salary, it takes a government organization that cares about these sorts of things to put them in place. So there are issues with places like a famous one is chocolate collection of the cocoa beans that are used in chocolate. For years, most large chocolate companies would outsource that work to places that grew cocoa beans, which were places very often in West Africa. And what they found were the companies, all they did is they just got the beans. They didn't ask any questions. Well, it turns out the companies they were buying them from were employing children who were not being paid for their work. It was literally children who were being treated as slaves. So when you were eating a Hershey chocolate bar, there was a good chance that the person who picked the beans that were turned into that chocolate bar was a child who was not being paid to do that. And these days, there are many industries in which that is still the case. Cotton production, collection of cotton out in Western China. There's a lot of, the Chinese government is denying it, but there's a lot of evidence that the cotton in your t-shirts are being picked by the Muslim minority in China, the Uyghur population, being forced to do slave labor. And this is another aspect of outsourcing. If it's farther away, it's much easier to turn a blind eye to any sort of human rights violations that are happening there. So even if, in theory, the world's outsourcing is going to give more jobs worldwide, it's also, in some sense, reducing the equality of opportunity because the people who get those jobs are not being paid a high wage. They are rather being paid a low wage, especially in comparison to the people who have millions of dollars. What are some other ways in which equality of opportunity has either helped or hurt? Let's work on help for a little bit, working off of Marcus's point of working remotely. What are some other increases in equality of opportunity that have come with modern technology? What are some things that were not accessible to people before?
Jobs in other countries.
Yeah, so jobs in other countries, you can now apply if you have certain skills. You no longer are limited to just working in a small place. If you learn computer technology, if you learn to program, you now have many more places you could go work because you can find out about the jobs elsewhere. So if you have, if you say are born in Bulgaria and live in a small town, but you get an education that allows you to learn coding, Now all of a sudden you could move anywhere in the world that needs a coder. You can, if you teach or learn if you learn cybersecurity, you can now get a job that is well paying anywhere in the world that needs cybersecurity. And this is possible because of the fact that you can travel elsewhere. There's also a thing of, you know, it used to be the case that if you were raised or if you learned a certain job and your country didn't need that job, you were kind of screwed. If you decided to go into, say, if you wanted to become a police officer and New York didn't need any more cops, you were screwed. Nowadays, if you decide to go into cybersecurity and it turns out like, oh, you know what? The cybersecurity options in Bulgaria aren't very high. Well, in the past, you would have been screwed. Now you can go, oh, wait, I can go and work in the United States because I have the skills to do it. I can go work in Europe because I have the skills to do it. So this is a way in which equality of opportunity has increased in certain respects. What's another thing that's changed? If you grew up in, say, a rural place and you wanted to become a, I don't know, what's something you might want to learn how to do that would have been hard in a rural place? I don't know. Let's just go with more computer stuff. Say you dreamed of becoming an engineer, or say you dreamed of becoming a software engineer.
You can either go to different places to learn.
Yeah, you have to go to different places to learn. And in particular, where would you have to go? A college. And what do you need to get into a college in most
A lot
places?
of money.
Yeah, you need money. You can't go there for free. Nowadays, if you want to learn Python or you want to learn C++, what do?
You do YouTube.
Yeah.
People are teaching. Also to continue with jobs like in other countries, it's like you don't even, it's like you could take that also to a smaller scale where you can actually work in another state. Like if you worked in New York and then you found a job, you can easily find a job in California, most likely.
So yeah, if you have the access to teach yourself things on YouTube, or you have the access, or you have the skills needed to search for jobs, you can now get more opportunities than ever before. So provided you have a certain level of education to get given this job, or provided you have internet access that would allow you to teach yourself, there are now ways that you can learn skills like never before. Jorge, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, no, Professor, on the same line, I just wanted to say that it's easier now also to get a hold of those research papers and journal articles. It's much easier. You don't need to go to like a library or the school library. You could get it online.
Yeah.
And Professor, just to get a little bit negative again, isn't like technology actually like English like might be like the I guess the official language of technology, right? Because so many things have been developed, and English is like an international. Like, what if you don't speak English? You don't have access to schooling, even in your own language sometimes, so let alone a different language.
Level. So I'm going to talk about your first point first and then the second point, because I think this is another key issue, which is it's now easier to get a hold of information than ever before. So it is easier to teach yourself. It is easier to learn things. It's easier to become, if you reach a certain level of access, if you have internet access, and you know how to use that internet access and you have the skills to do so, you can learn like never before. But notice that big word if here. There's this if, and this if is only if you meet criteria like you have access to a computer, you're fluent in English. If most of the research papers on computer technology are in English and you don't speak English, none of these things are true for you. If you didn't get the minimum level of education needed to teach yourself things, none of this matters. So what we see is, on the one hand, if you clear a certain bar and you have a computer and you have knowledge of English and you have the time to research things on your own, then you are able to get this access like never before. However, on the flip side, if you're somebody who doesn't meet that bar, it seems like your opportunities are less than ever before. And here's this, I'm going to erase this here and put up the first of the key terms that we're going to be talking about, or that was in the reading, which is this notion of a digital divide. So what is a divide?
Like a separation, Professor?
Separation. So what is a digital divide? Well, a digital divide is a separation between the people who have access to digital technologies and those who don't. So there's this thing of all of this is true. If you have a computer technology, if you have the knowledge to use it, if you speak the language it's written in, you now have opportunities that never existed before. You can teach yourself. But because of how important it is, more so than ever before in our history, earning a living wage is tied to education more than ever before. For most of human history, most people did not have a college education. It's only within the past 50 years that college educations became pretty much the norm amongst the workforce. Before that, the majority of people could get by never having anything more than, basic grammar school. Why? Well, because to get a living wage, you only needed to have a certain set of skills because of what we were talking about before in terms of salaries and the sorts of working in a factory. My grandpa worked in a factory. That was his only job. He made puzzles, and he was able to have a middle-class family with 3 children, and it was totally fine. Nowadays, factory work is not going to be enough to necessarily pay that. Instead, you need an education. Why? Because to take advantage of the new opportunities provided by digital technology, you need to clear a certain bar of education. So what we have now is the tech haves versus the tech have nots. Before, it didn't really matter if you had a computer or not. If you didn't know how to use a computer, you could still get by. Nowadays, the difference between people who have access to computers and those who do not is so large that if you don't have good internet connection, you genuinely are so far back. Like, it doesn't matter how smart you are, how skilled you are, how hard you're willing to work. If you don't have access to the internet, you are going to be so far behind somebody, even if it's imagine a lazy person who's very unintelligent. If they have a computer and you don't, they're going to learn more than you do, no matter how hard you try. And that's just the fact of the matter. And this is what the notion of the digital divide is while, yes, technology is everywhere, in many cases, it's so built in our society that if you don't have access to it, you're just so far behind the 8 ball that it can be really hard to catch up. But there's also, so this is like the digital divide in an extreme case. There's also, however, even within the tech haves, there are some differences. So what do I mean by that? Well, does everyone have access to the same amount of technology? And I think a good way is what Jorge brought up before is think about how the COVID pandemic has affected people. Think about who has been affected most by the pandemic in terms of schooling and who is affected less.
The poor are affected more.
And why?
Is because like they can't afford to have the technology, but at the same time, some can argue that it's not really like the company's fault. I guess it is. It's like it's they technically have the same opportunity, like equal opportunity, because like it's paid. Like you could either take a lower plan, like there's options for lower people most like sometimes, but at the same time, like it's like as long as there's no favoritism, I guess, like it's like okay and it's like equal, but at the same time people are arguing that like it's not equal because you charge so much.
So let's not talk about the like legality or the rightness of a company charging more or less. Let's just talk strictly in terms of opportunity and the amount you have. If you make $1 million a year versus, say, a family that brings home 40K a year, say it's 2-parent house, one of them brings home $1 million, The other brings home 40,000. They both have 2 kids.
Oh, yeah, then
And
I guess
now COVID strikes. COVID strikes and these kids are learning remotely. What is the difference going to be between the learning experience of these children?
one might have or the person who makes $1 million is going to have an easier time of like using technology and having access to it than 40,000 because they have they're more purchasing power. The one to like do what they want, but a person who makes 40K has to sacrifice a lot. If
Yes,
not, they might not be able to do it.
Let's go with some concrete examples. So this one here, the family with $1 million, if they need more computers in the house, say their 7-year-old now needs to take class online. And before they had 3 laptops, but 4 people living in the house. Now what do? They need, both kids are at school at the same time. What do? They just buy
Just
another
buy one.
computer. Yeah. If you're 40K, you've only got, say, 3 computers in the house. Can you afford that 4th computer?
No.
Maybe not, depending on.
Maybe not. It's a question.
Professor,
So that's the first thing. Jorge, yeah.
I was gonna say, even logistically, if you have that $1 million family, they'll have their own room, you know, like a proper work station or study station, you know.
Yeah, it's really hard to study when your parents are walking around you. And I've seen a lot of you, like those of you who have had computers, I've seen people having to try to learn with their parents in the same room. That is hard. That is not easy. If you are wealthy, you have a big house, you're able to just put a child in a different rooms out of sound from another child. If you share an apartment with like a 1-bedroom apartment with 4 people, you simply, the learning is going to be more difficult. What else do we have here? What are some other differences? If you're the $1 million a year family and your child is struggling in school online, what can you do?
You get tutors.
Yeah, you can hire a tutor.
Yeah, Professor, I was gonna say, I work as a doorman, and almost everybody has a tutor.
Yeah.
But I don't see tutors in like a low income neighborhood.
No, and the fact is, those make huge differences. So if you have the money to afford a tutor and your child is struggling, your child is now going to be able to offset that to a certain degree. So what we have is, before the pandemic, let's say you have 2 kids that are equally smart, and they both go to school and they're doing equally well. This child is the one from this family. This child is the one from this family. Well, now the pandemic hits and they both start struggling. They're both going backwards. However, this one, the one from the poor family, is going back faster because their learning environment is worse. Also, their parents are probably having to leave the house to work very hard. Another fact of the matter is generally it's the higher paying jobs that have been able to work from home. It's things like lawyers that do not have to go into the office. Well, if you work for you can't be a doorman unless you go to the door. You can't be a doorman unless you go there. You can be a lawyer from afar and you just communicate by email. So if you're somebody who has to leave, your kids are now on their own. This child is falling farther and farther behind. Not only that, this kid can then hire a tutor, which can bring them back up. So if before, these kids would have, before COVID, ended up with more or less the same degree of learning, you've now got a case in which the wealthy one is learning less well than this one, than he would have or she would have otherwise. But they're so far ahead of the lower income kid that when it comes time to get a job one day, neither of them are going to be as well prepared as if the pandemic hadn't happened. But the one who started wealthy is going to be in a much better position than the one who didn't start wealthy. Correct.
Yeah, Professor, I was going to say, it goes back to like that access to opportunity. And it's become like a self-fulfilling thing. When you are looking for that job, you're going to be at disadvantage every time. You're not going to have the qualifications because you didn't have that opportunity from the get-go.
And this is something that I think, as technology is becoming more and more a part of our lives, the people who have better access to better technology are getting advantages. So, well, in a certain sense, we think of it as, and technology companies tell us that it's making everyone's lives better and easier. And I think to a certain extent, they're not lying because of things like that Jorge brought up before, like things like medicine. Overall, the odds that you're going to die of a disease are lower now than ever before in history, simply because of the fact that we have technology that has allowed us to develop new medicines and things like that. However, even if, like, as a matter of fact, you now have an Apple phone and your iPhone allows you to be, like, if we say like 1980, and the level of education you could get in 1980, say your well-being was here and a poor, say a wealthy person's was here and a poor person's was here, and now in 2021, the poor person, their life has improved somewhat. The issue is, with modern technology, you might worry that the wealthy person who has access to this technology is now so far ahead and the gap has increased so much that now, even if you are better than you were, money, numbers wise, or ease of information wise, the people you're competing against on the job market are so much better off than you that, relatively speaking, even if strictly like hardcore numbers, you make more money than you did. Well, if you make more money than you did, it doesn't matter if other people are making so much more money than they did. So
Well,
does everyone,
Professor, yeah, like it makes a lot of sense. Like like the core problem is not being addressed. So what technology does is just, I mean, the same trend, like you see it, like if you see it statistically in a long period.
and yeah, so what technology has in some ways done is it's just, even if it's improving life in some senses, it's widening the gap between the haves and the have-nots to such a degree that you might worry that it's not actually improving life for most people. And in fact, it's making life harder for most people because the amount of work you have to do to offset your lack of technology is so high that you end up having a worse life. You have to get more jobs. Yes, you might be able to do more at your job, but if to pay the bills, if the bills are going up as more technologies come along, and the assumption is you need to have those technologies. 50 years ago, a family didn't need to buy a computer. Money could be spent on other things. You didn't need to get your kid an iPhone. Nowadays, if you don't have an iPhone, if you don't get email on your phone, you're legitimately at a disadvantage in things like school. You cannot get the information that's going to be assumed. If you have crappy internet access compared to somebody with the best internet access, something like Zoom teaching becomes impossible. And so what you end up with is this worry that this digital divide, technology told us that it was going to bridge the gap between the poor and the wealthy. It was going to bridge the gap between the haves and the have-nots as the wages or as things got cheaper and as technology spread. But there's this worry of, is that really what's happening, or is it actually increased the gap between the haves and the have-nots? All right. The digital divide, and part of the reason that the digital divide matters so much is because of something we've been talking about, is the digital divide is very much tied in with the economic divide. If it was just the case that, some people have access to a beach, some people don't. If you live by the beach, you get to go to the beach. If you don't live by the beach, you don't. But that doesn't really have that much impact. Or if you live in California, you have access to more warm weather. Like, yes, that is a matter of fact, but it doesn't really have major downstream consequences. However, the digital divide seems to, in large part, because of the economic divide, and especially because there's this self-fulfilling prophecy, as Jorge said, in which opportunities and economics kind of feed into each other. So why do we want equality of opportunity? Well, we want equality of opportunity because that will allow people to get jobs that they, a higher salary, pay for things. But once you have more money, you can start to do things like put it back into the opportunities for your children. If you are wealthy and COVID strikes, you can get you can turn those economics into more opportunities. To go in extreme cases, did anyone follow these stories the other year of what was happening with these students getting into Harvard and other top schools? Did people hear about this story?
Oh,
Wait,
yeah,
are you
where
talking about?
they were basically paying their way into the school, was it?
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. They're
Yeah,
basically backdooring the school.
it was literally what was happening is they were families with a lot of money were literally paying the admissions people. They would pay, yeah, it was the college scandal. People who were wealthy literally were turning that money into getting accepted in schools. So in this sort of case, it's like that was illegal and extreme. But what we see is it's not just in these illegal extreme ways that we turn money into opportunity. There are many legal ways in which this happens. I already talked about the ones with COVID, but what are some of the other ways in which this opportunity that comes from access to technology turns into money, which then turns back into more opportunity?
Professor, I was going to say even a factor, even the neighborhood where you live is a factor, Professor. When you have access to a better school.
Yeah, where you live matters. Another thing, I mean, New York City is the biggest place in the country in which the divide, in terms of the divide between public and private schools, if you have the money to send your kid to a private school in New York compared to going to a New York City public school, people will go there. And the fact of the matter is, the education you're getting at a private school is going to be very different than the education you get at a public school. But to go to that private school, what do you need? In the United States, or especially in New York, the answer is not just money, the answer is shitloads of money. Also, you can send your kids to private elementary schools, to private middle schools, and all of these things then prepare them better to then get a job or go to a school that will allow them to get a better job, thereby making more money. So what we see is this cycle. And these days, what's the number one thing that's correlated with how wealthy you'll be when you grow up? So it used to be.
I'm sorry, I was going to say, I know of this school that in the Upper West Side where parents pay $50,000 a year or even more, I think it was now.
Yes.
And even the people that you meet there, Professor, all the people that I guess you would call them like the owners of big corporations, the kids, you meet them there. So you are friends from high school, Professor.
That's another really great point is one of the major determiners as you get older and you experience it more, the more you realize that it's a lot less about what you know and a lot more about who you know. If you know somebody who is in a career, they can at least give you, I mean, they're not necessarily, if they're a moral person, just going to give you a job because they know you, but they can give you the inside background sorts of stories. What sort of things should you emphasize? What sorts of things should you do? Well, if you go to one of these schools that it's $50,000 to $100,000 a year for high school, the only other people who are going to be there are going to be other people who can afford to send whose parents can afford to send them to a $75,000 a year high school, which means that these are going to be wealthy people, which means they're going to be things like CEOs. They're going to be things like politicians, people with a lot of money. So not only that, you now are going to know by the time you go into college, you know people whose parents are important. You are going to know people. If you grow up where I grew up, where many of us here have grown up, I didn't know any famous people growing up. I didn't know any famous people's kids. But if you grow up and go to one of these super wealthy private schools, it's almost a guarantee that you know some actor or some politician or some CEO's kid. And once you know them, that is actually something that you can exploit once you get to the job market. You can call up your friend and ask their dad, like, I know you worked for this company. How did you do it? What sorts of things can you use? If I were to try to figure out how to be a CEO, like I want to be a CEO one day, I want to go into banking. I have no idea how to do that. I'm not trained in those ways. I didn't talk to some CEO's kid when I was in high school, but if that's what's around me, I have those connections. So that's a really good point, Jorge. It's not just the hardcore economics, it's also the connections that come with that.
And Professor, just one last thing I want to say about that is that you think your network is bigger than what you think, because their network becomes sort of your network, you know, and it's a big network to start with, Professor. You know?
And so these days in the United States, if I were trying to, what's the best way? I'm trying to think of the best way of wording this question. What's the number one thing that determines whether you'll be rich when you grow up? Is it hard work? Is it the job you have? What is the number one factor?
I think for me, I think your family.
And it's not specifically your family, it's how wealthy your family is. If you want to be a millionaire in this country, the best way of doing it is to be born into a millionaire family. And that's by far and away the most likely way. And then on top of that, to add into this, if you are somebody trying to climb your way up and you don't go to a CUNY school, you realize that the sorts of people you are going to meet at, like, I want to go into politics. Therefore, I should go to Harvard because I will meet other senators' kids who are at Harvard, who are able to get the best education and are now here. And that's where I want to be. But I'm a lower income person. And while Harvard gives me half a scholarship, they don't give me a full scholarship. What's going to happen when I get out of Harvard?
Or you, professor, if you graduate from Harvard, you'll immediately get a job.
Yes and no. These days, it's who the hell knows. But yeah, in one sense, though, even if you do get a job, though, you're going to be saddled with debt. And that debt is the sort of thing that can prevent you. I mean, yes, there are certain sorts of schools, like if you go to Harvard, it becomes much easier to get a job at the other end, but it's not like a guarantee because of the fact that these days, if you want to get a job in a certain type of area, because education is becoming more and more valuable, even something like a college degree isn't enough in certain sorts of fields. So like in these sorts of like big hedge funds, like the big time hedge funds, movers and shakers, the people who are making millions and millions of dollars for their company through investments, most of the people who work there now have PhDs. And not necessarily a PhD in economics, but just a PhD in something. And so this is a way in which even going in like a college degree in a certain way is enough. And if you have a large debt to begin with, you aren't going to be getting these sorts of opportunities that someone who comes out of college with no debt at all has. Jorge, you wanted to say something when I cut you off.
I wanted to say that the way we set up our system is that we actually give more, I don't know if value is the right word, somebody that graduates from Columbia, let's say, or a community school. So your employer is going to look at the Columbia student first, I think.
Absolutely.
I would do that.
There's this issue here with name recognition, because another aspect of another problem with the amount of information that's out there is we are so overwhelmed with information that people start having to cut corners. So for instance, if you want to 50 years ago, you wanted to get a job teaching somewhere, you would be up in just like academic professorships are the thing I'm most familiar with. It used to be the case that if you wanted to get a tenure track position at a state university, because of the nature of it, the number of people applying for the jobs was, high, but it was, you're competing against 25 people. These days you're competing against, I remember the other year there was a job at City College where 500 people applied for one spot. And why is that possible? Because of the amount of technology and the way in which the most qualified people are able to connect. So if you live halfway around the world and you're super qualified, you can now apply for that job. But what that means is you have to keep putting more money into your education to compete, because the best of the best end up looking better. And one of the side effects of this, as Jorge was just pointing out, is if you get 200, 300 applications, you can't read every single one. Instead, you're going to rely on things like, well, I know Columbia is a good school, so maybe I should look at that person, without actually looking more closely, because you simply don't have time. So that's another way, is as we get more overwhelmed, we end up taking shortcuts in how we decide on what sorts of information we can take the time to process as somebody who's hiring, as somebody who's not, or somebody who's applying for a job. So does all of this make sense, how the digital divide ties into this economic divide? And the economic divide is very much tied in with the sort of tied in with opportunity divides. And as the digital divide, in some sense, does raise opportunity, it also lowers opportunity in a lot of ways. So does all of this make sense to people?
Yes, Professor. It's like a whole cycle.
It's a whole thing. And the thing is, like, I'm not trying to say like it's anybody's fault. Like, I'm not trying to point fingers at this point. I just want, a lot of the time we give in because of the nature of our minds and we're so overwhelmed. We read things like Facebook say, we're bringing the world together, and Apple's commercials saying, giving connectedness like never before. And so we focus on the positives. But it's important to recognize, to take the time to step back and go, wait a second, I need to be aware of all of this other stuff as well. You can't just solve all of these sorts of issues with technology, because they are causing issues as well. Technology is not fixing the problems that we had before. It's fixing some, causing other ones to pop up, making certain things better, making other things worse. All right, so what I want to do now is transition to the second type of equality, inequality talk. We've had the digital divide, we've had the economic stuff. Based on people who have done the readings or read the syllabus, what's the second type of equality, inequality stuff I want to talk about? Think about it while I run to the bathroom real quick. I'll be back in 2 minutes. I just need a little break and to grab a glass of water because I forgot mine in the other room. I'll be right back. Think about, what are we talking about next? We've talked about economic and opportunity together, but equality of opportunity is also tied in with other sorts of considerations. So, recording resumed. All right, there are other types of inequality in this world, and those sorts of inequality are also tied in with information technology and digital technology. So what other types of inequality are there that interact with these sorts of digital considerations?
Racial and gender.
Yeah, racial and gender. And basically, what I want to bring up here is the ways in which, and what I want to talk about for the rest of class, is how things like sexism and then feminism and equality pushes, as well as racism and anti-racism campaigns, all of them are tied together with computer technology. And computer technology has had positive impacts on some of these things, like it has helped bring awareness to racial inequality, but it has also in a lot of ways reinforced racial inequality. And in the same way, modern technology has brought about gender equality in certain ways, but also reinforced gender inequality in other ways. And what we find here is that in both cases, these are going to, again, be tied in with equality of opportunity. So let's start with the racial side. Tech and race. Benefits to anti-racism. Benefits to racism. So let's talk about tech and race first. Why is it the case, or what are some ways in which modern technology, digital technology, what is this word I'm looking for? Intersects with race? So, what are some ways in which considerations around digital technology are interacting with things like race and racism?
Professor, in the same way that it's easy to get access to information, and we talk about misinformation, all these really hurtful ideas are like easily spread, you know?
This is a really good one, and this is something we're going to be coming back to more and more often. There has been a rise in what is typically called white nationalism, but more accurately, just like hardcore white supremacist views in the past 20 years. We just had a president who would say incredibly racist things, and yet this president got elected. What has changed in the past 20 years that has allowed this to happen?
Professor, I took last semester a history class.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, this white supremacy is always been in our society. You know,
so let's be clear. It has always been in our society, but we've never before had, until last term, a president who came out and explicitly said things like all Mexicans are rapists. That was never a thing that had happened before. So what changed? We also never before had a group of people invade the US Capitol trying to overthrow the government. Like that has not happened. So what has changed? So to be clear, as Jorge points out, racism has been around in this country since the founding. We've had our country written into the Constitution was slavery. Also, there were lynchings of people of color for years for things they did not do. There was vigilante justice. Whites versus non-whites were treated very differently in court for years. Up until the 1960s in the South, there was segregation. You could not stay in certain hotels if you were Black. All of this is true, but there has been a shift compared to, say, 1970 to today. There has been a change in which white nationalist currents are louder than they had been before. And what has changed? Jorge.
Oh no, the communication, Professor. Because it's so much easier to communicate that you could have the same amount of people thinking the same way, but now they could share their ideas and expand on them easier now.
Yeah. So one thing is, it used to be the case that white nationalism was in certain places was the norm, but in many parts of the country was very rare. And so if you were one of these people who had these extreme views, you were going to find it difficult to find other people who held your extreme views. Therefore, over time, you are less likely to act on them or talk about them. Nowadays, if everybody is together talking about, if you're able to find other people who share your views, you can organize, you can form these militias of people who get together with guns and attack the Capitol. Like part of the reason that this was able to happen is because of things like WhatsApp and because of things like Reddit
Facebook.
and 4chan and Facebook. All of this made it easier for these groups to rally together and communicate. Jorge.
No, Professor. I forgot what I was gonna say. I'm sorry.
No worries. Marcus, did you want to say something? Was there somebody else? All right. Now, on the flip side of this, though, if it's easier to collect together white nationalists, who is it also possible? Who else has been organizing? And this is going to be on the positive side.
People who like who have been oppressed. I guess that's the best way to probably say it.
On the same side as, yes, white nationalists are organizing, there's also a reason that the Black Lives Matter movement has become something within the past decade and a half. These currents have always been here, but there's a way in which it has been changed to a degree by modern technology. Police brutality has been going on in the nation to people of color for a long time. However, things have changed recently in a lot of ways. Jorge, what were you going to say?
I was going to say the benefits also. You talk about Black Lives Matter. Also, remember the Arab Spring?
Yeah.
How they were able to organize and protest like they've never in the past, right? Because of that communication.
Yeah. So another side is that it has allowed people to organize together to fight for things, both what we would generally say are bad things versus what we would generally say are good things. Arab Spring was a movement to try to bring more democratic leadership across the Middle East. Black Lives Matter, we're all familiar with it. These things were able to come into existence in large part because of modern technology. So the very same forces that are leading people to collect together to be more racist are also bringing people together to fight racism. And part of the reason that people are, there's been such a strong backlash of white nationalism and of white supremacy is that these movements have now been created in such a way that racists are feeling scared. They are now seeing organization that they've never seen before.
Professor, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
no, go ahead. I like to be clear, I would much rather have you interrupt than me just ramble on.
It has been exposed. You know, it's easier to spot now. Like we talked about this in previous lectures, but things that we thought were not there, they've always been there, but now we just technology has exposed them, like all these racist philosophies.
Yeah, that's another thing is what's the main difference between police brutality 50 years ago and police brutality now? There's one piece of technology that has fundamentally changed our relationship in this case.
Or the
Yeah,
camera, right? Video camera.
it's right here. Right here, this is what's changed. We are now able to record things happening. And as much as we can hear about something, there's a fact of the matter that when you see something happening, it fundamentally changes our reaction to it. If you hear that somebody was suffocated for 9 minutes, that's one thing. If you watch it, it's something very, very different. Also, because of the technology, more videos come in over and over again. So if things are happening to this degree, we are now able to expose them like never before. So that is another way in which it's changed. It's not just that we can now talk about it, it's also that we have the ability to prove it. It's now the case that police officers have to wear body cameras. And so it's almost always the case that there is some other evidence to be brought to bear. It used to be the case if one person says one thing and another person says another, not much is going to happen. But if one person says one thing, another person says another and has a video of it, things start to change. So this is another way in which tech has really changed it. Now, what are some other, however, ways in which both racism, anti-racism have been affected by modern technology? We've been talking about the anti-racist and racist movements, but there are other ways as well. I just put AI up here. What is AI? And I don't mean it in the like extreme sense of Star Wars and other sorts of movies. I mean it in the sense that it exists today.
Artificial intelligence, right?
Artificial intelligence, which in today's context doesn't mean robots running around. What is AI in today's technology? It's everywhere around us all the time. So to give an example, AI is very tied in with those data mining sorts of operations we talked about before. So for instance, when you go on to Google and Google tells you you might want to buy, or you go on to Amazon, you go on to Walmart, and it says, consider buying this. Who was responsible? Was there somebody sitting in a room looking at your past purchases and saying, this person probably wants some new sneakers?
Professor, it's like an algorithm that applies those like AI, I guess, but they study your behavior, what you have shopped in the past, so to determine what you might shop in the future, or listen to music. So it's everywhere, like you said.
It's basically, the way you can think about AI is a computer decision-making process. So you give it a certain degree of inputs. It then analyzes those inputs to decide what is likely to be the case. So if you buy shoes, and shoes, it will then, initially the way there's going to be a program here in the middle, an artificial intelligence program, which learns on the basis of what your past purchases are to predict what your future purchases are. So if the only thing you've ever bought is shoes, and shoes, then initially this program is going to think like, oh, you know what? This sort of thing, we're going to assume at the beginning that this is the average American consumer who buys lots of different things. The first time you buy shoes, the program will then think, well, they bought shoes once, so it's slightly more likely they're going to buy shoes again. So my prediction is now they're going to buy shoes a little bit more likely. Once you bought shoes, and all you've ever bought is shoes, this program is going to think, okay, this person probably only, it's not literally going to be thinking because it's a computer program, but its output will be, it'll come to the conclusion, it will learn that you only ever buy shoes. And on the basis of that, will then output, assume the next purchase will be shoes, and start suggesting shoes to you. So that's the background of how artificial intelligence works. Now, the key idea behind artificial intelligence is that it learns from the inputs given to it. The program itself is just a basic learning mechanism. If you were to only show it pictures of red things, it would come to the conclusion that only red things exist. If you were to only show it pictures of cats, it would only learn to identify cats. So does everyone understand just generally how what we call AI works? It's a way of analyzing. You start with a data set, it learns from them, and then makes predictions on the basis of what it's been given. Does this make sense?
Yes, Professor.
They're programs that govern many parts of our lives. Now, why am I bringing it up here? Well, the issue is that because of so much of our lives, okay, so here's the question. Are computers racist? Are machines racist? Can a piece of metal be racist?
No, Professor.
No, a piece of metal cannot be. My pen cannot be racist. My physical piece of metal cannot be racist. However, the problem is that a program which is not racist and a machine that is not racist can start behaving in ways that are very similar and draw a lot of the same conclusions as race. Because what an AI program will do is, if it's programmed in such a way that is perfectly benign, it has no biases, but you then put it in to learn in a racist world, it will start to make predictions that are racist. It will, or if you give it inputs that are in no way equal to everybody, it'll start to display tendencies that are racist. So facial recognition is one of the clearest ways of this. What is facial recognition software? Anyone know?
It's basically AI, or because like they have to match it based on certain parameters they set, and like you said before, like in a previous lecture, where basically they use test subjects as a base, and usually it's better at determining white people than black people.
Yeah. So this is a human face. And the way a human face is that everyone's face, you can make a pretty good prediction out of that face, just based on, and you can, like, there are certain points on the face that if you select the data of those points, you can then, even at a different angle of the face, like if the face were then turned, be pretty good at matching, like, are those exact same points the same face? And so the way it works is the technology learns to identify an image of a face with ones that have come before on the basis of what it's been presented with. So what it will learn to do is it learns over time what sorts of matches to make by being fed other faces. So at the beginning, it doesn't know how to recognize faces very well. It just knows to look for certain points. Over time, though, you give it more and more and more and more faces. And what ends up happening is the face itself ends up being remembered, and also the technology learns how to better recognize faces. The problem is it's only going to become good at recognizing faces similar to those it was presented with, which, as a matter of fact, most of the people who are designing this software are working at large tech companies. And these large tech companies, as their subjects, for money reasons and simplicity reasons, are going to give these faces whatever's at hand. It's going to use people who work at that company as the subjects for this, which over time basically meant that these programs were taught to be very good at identifying white men and be very bad at identifying women of color. Not because the program was intrinsically racist, but just because the data it was given only taught it how to deal with those cases. It only learned to identify white faces very well because that's all it was presented with. Now, you might think like, okay, then all we have to do is fix this problem, get better algorithms, or give it a better data set. The problem is, by the time anyone realized these problems were happening, because everyone was thinking, well, a facial recognition technology can't be racist. It's just a computer. It's a literal program. How could it be racist? Where was facial recognition technology being employed? Where was it being used?
Law enforcement, I read, Professor.
Yeah, law enforcement started using it because the idea is we want a technology who's going to be able to recognize someone at a crime scene, match it with our known records of what people look like, and identify who the criminal was. In an ideal world, that would be great. The problem was it kept misidentifying people of color. And they did so I think it was 2018, they did a study of the one that Amazon was working on. Amazon was working on a facial recognition. And what they did is they presented it with all the members of the United States Congress. So all the senators and all the members of the House of Representatives, and it incorrectly identified something like 24 members of Congress as wanted criminals. And it did it just because it had learned it could not identify these members of Congress who were not white, because it had never been trained on these sorts of faces. So these are the ways in which these sorts of problems, AI is not intrinsically racist, but it will begin to behave in racist ways if it's taught by a data set that has certain sorts of, or responses to certain sorts of systematic racism within the nation. Why was it the case that it was mainly using white people? Well, because mainly white people were working at Google. And why was it the case that only white people were working at Google? Well, lots of systematic racism in history. Jorge.
Yeah, Professor, another thing I was going to say also, like our prison system, the population is, the majority of the people in prison are minorities. So that's a big problem, right, that I was reading with
Yeah, and so another issue with that is, if as a matter of fact, in the United States, the majority of people who end up in prison are people of color. And the reason why is a long history having to do with many different things, socioeconomic, racism in the justice system. There are many different factors. But one of the issues of this is that people who are already more likely to be targeted by the justice system become even more likely if we have these sorts of AI programs that are designed to do these sorts of things. Now, what are other ways in which technology either has benefits to anti-racism or benefits to racism? Well, I want to talk about the statistics of something at Google. Stats at a place like Google or Facebook. What are some of, so on the one hand, there are ways in which we want our hiring practices to a certain extent to be blind. We want to hire the best candidates for the job. We want to hire people who are the most qualified because you just want to make money as a company and you want your company to do as well as possible. However, there are some issues here around having a workforce that is only, let me find my statistics.
Yeah, Professor.
Yes.
Yeah, I was gonna say what you find in the economy at large, you find it in this tech companies where you have like really few female workers as employees, minorities as well.
Yeah. And so here is a here are the numbers at Google as of, I think these were like the 2017 stats. Of the people who worked at Google, 3.3% were Black, 5.8% were of Latinx origin. In executive and higher level positions, it was 2.6% Black, 3.3%. Now, if I remember correctly, the percentage of people in the United States who fall into one of these categories is, I think, above 20%. So we're at about half the percentage if you group them together compared to this. Now, on the one hand, you can look at this and like, is Google trying to be racist in their hiring? Is it that the CEO of Google is sitting there going, you know what? I don't want people of color at my company. Is that what has led to this point?
Probably not. It depends because like it's like, do they have the skill set really? Because
Yeah.
because there's laws, I think, this like preventing discrimination, and it's been mostly about skill set.
Yeah, and so the fact of the matter is, at very few companies are they trying to be racist in their hiring practices. However, there's a worry that the nature of technology has led to these sorts of things for some of the reasons we talked about before with in terms of opportunity. Because what do you need to do to work at Google? If you want to work at Google, what do you have to do?
Meet their qualifications.
You need to meet their qualifications, which as a matter of fact involve much schooling and generally a good education. And also you need to want to become somebody who works at Google. So the issue with these statistics at Google is that why is it then that we see so many fewer people of color working at a company like Google? What is the historical reasons? Why is it that there are only 2.6% of the people in higher up positions at Google are black?
They're not most like there's not a lot of education or like that's like stereotypes, I guess, like that, and it's also a real fact that like usually people of color don't have the same economic opportunities because like they're poor most of the like usually a lot of them are poor and like they're uneducated because like of the neighborhood, etc.
So here's the fact that and again, these are generalizations that apply statistically. These are not claims about the intrinsic nature of people of color or anything like that. It's rather that for historical reasons, people of color in the United States have generally been of lower economic status than white people, therefore making it more difficult for them to afford the higher level educations you need. So the people who are going into Google are going to have to be educated, which is already going to mean you're going to be selecting from a larger percentage of people that are white. Jorge.
Yeah, Professor, I was going to say there is a factor also. It's like they call it, I think, implicit racism.
Yes.
Or where you rather work with people that look like you, or the majority of people at your company.
Yeah, and here's another issue. Why do these numbers continue to be low? Well, one of them is you just can't overturn this stuff overnight and suddenly make it so that people of color are going into computer science more and more. But it's also things like we as a species have certain elements of implicit racism. Let's just go with it right now. Everyone close your eyes and picture the IT guy at John Jay. Your computer's not working. They have to come up and fix it. What do they look like? What does this person in the IT department look like in your mind?
For me, I think of a white guy.
Yeah, I picture, to put my cards on the table, I picture a white man wearing glasses, just as Christopher does. So in this way, if you have an image of what you expect somebody to look like, you cannot help in certain ways of affecting this. On the flip side, people like to work and feel safe. There's a reason why there's such an emphasis on making sure that people feel safe in a school community. You don't want to learn if you're afraid or if you feel out of place. How many of you have been the minority in a room and you are very aware of it? The majority is not aware that they're the majority. They're just there. This is normal. But the minority will feel somewhat out of place. So if you are somebody who goes to Google as a person of color, you become very aware that you are the only person of color there. If you are somebody who, therefore, that is always taking up some of your brain space. So this sort of thing will mean not only are you less likely to get selected, if you are, there's a chance that you aren't going to feel welcome there. And one of the major reasons to switch over to sexism for a minute, that there are so few women at these sorts of companies, is that the percentage of women who stay on after some amount of time are much lower. They might begin at a place like Google, but over time, they are more likely to resign or leave the company because they do not feel as welcome or as comfortable in that sort of environment. And so on the flip side, Ben, it's not just though that like these statistics are being caused by past events of racism. It's rather that also they can have effects down the line. They can have impacts on things that cause the society as a whole. It's not just that we have this history of racism that then leads to these statistics. It's rather once we have these statistics, they can then, as a self-fulfilling prophecy, reinforce racism in ways like this sort of AI consideration. It's because of the fact that there were so many white people working at Google that the AI became good at recognizing white faces. It's because of also, what are some other ways in which this happens? What are some other ways in which the demographics at a company like Google can have downstream effects on society as a whole? Can anyone think of any examples or think of like a fictional way in which this might happen?
Wait, sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, here's the question is, we know that these are the numbers at Google. Let's imagine that as a matter of fact, nobody at Google had any negative intentions, and rather these hiring practices happen due to mainly historical reasons having to do with the pipeline of where people come from and how educated they are. Even if we accept the fact that there was nothing bad that led to the fact that these percentages are what they are, it might still have bad consequences. What are some bad consequences that it might have for the world as a whole if the people working at Google are vast majority white? Or another one, what are some impacts it might even have on Google that are negative because they're
Basically, like it's always going to be a thing of like, oh, people are going to claim like even if you statistically prove and like you can confirm that like that it's like nothing really bad happening, there's always like I guess think of it like of a elitist, I guess, like type of group where basically Google becomes that elitist because they have like even they have like the select few, I guess, and then like they can look down at others, and then also with other countries, like it's I guess it could provide because they want more maybe more of their people being represented in the thing, but at the same time, like it's been proven that there is nothing wrong with like their hiring practices and etc. If
yeah,
that's
so,
true.
yeah, even if there's nothing wrong, what's the problem of Google being elitist, both for Google and for society as a whole?
It's made for the wealthy most of the
Yeah.
time.
What it ends up doing is you end up with technology that is catered to the needs of a certain group of people. And what is the problem with that? Well, it ends up hurting, well, the society as a whole. And it also, though, ends up hurting Google because they are missing out on potential demographics of people who want their products. The fact is that there were for many years, actually, you know what? I want to bring out this more by switching over to the gender side, because I think it's even clearer to show the issues in these sorts of ways with sexism and the way in which the statistics at a company like Google do reinforce sorts of sexist practices in ways that we can see are both hurting the company and also hurting the society as a whole. So let's talk about I'm going to leave the statistic up here as 23% identify as women. Benefits to let's call it So the first thing I want to say is that in both cases, we have the same considerations that we had with racism. In the same way that sexism, individuals who are sexist are able to organize like never before. So you have online movements like the incel movement. You have online movements of people who basically troll to the point of being straight up harassment of women in a public field. That has increased due to internet technology. On the same side, though, things like #MeToo were able to take off because of internet technology. And nowadays, it's much easier where one of the main reasons that sexual harassment was so underreported was that you had to go to the police and you had to go through an incredibly long and incredibly draining and incredibly unpleasant reliving of a sexual harassment case in front of people who were inclined not to believe you and whose job it was to ask you lots of pressing questions. And so because of that, it was going underrepresented. Now people can go online and just share their stories in a way that is more likely to be heard, more likely to be appreciated and taken at face value. And all of that is possible due to modern technology. So that's one way in which sexism and anti-sexism have been affected by modern technology. Another way is increasing sexism. The same AI issues that come up with race come up in the case of sexism. So there was one technology that they were trying to train a computer to identify women and identify men. And they ended up giving them, as the data set, just giving them photos from magazines. Just over time, we're showing them photos from magazines because that's a good way of giving them sample sets. The problem was, can anyone guess what this AI program determined was the best way to identify whether someone was a woman? It was just giving magazine photos over and over again. Over time, wasn't clothing, that's close, not hair either.
Professor, could it be your skin color?
It wasn't skin color. These are all things not face. We'd think face. No. It was, is this individual in the kitchen? Because as a matter of fact, if you look at most magazines, men are pictured not in kitchens, and a large percentage of women in magazines are in things like cooking magazines. And so what this AI program learned was, if you're in a kitchen, then you're a woman. And that's the best way to find out whether something's a woman. You just see, is it in a kitchen? And that is not something we want. That is just an AI program learning one of the worst sexist stereotypes that's out there, that women belong in kitchens. And yet it did it in this innocuous way of you just present it with photos. Also, it would probably come to the conclusion of, what do men wear? Well, men spend most of their time fully clothed, and women spend a high percentage of their time in bikinis. Because again, that's what so many of the photos in magazines of women are. So you end up with this somewhat biased view through the AI program itself. Now, what are some other ways then? And the one I want to talk about is, what are the consequences of the fact that only 23% of women at Google, or 23% of the people at Google are women? What are the downstream effects? What are the negative problems that causes for society at large in a way that is sexist? And what are the ways that it makes Google or any sort of tech company itself more sexist?
Yeah, Professor, like the women's input is not doesn't have the same weight as the men, like just by the numbers.
Yeah, so one thing that it leads to is, just as a matter of fact, your technology ends up being catered, because as a matter of fact, we cannot help but be most familiar with our own experience. So we cannot help but make sure that we are going to tell the story of somebody and think from our own experience what things are needed. So if I'm a man and I'm trying to think of what sorts of things need to go into a health screening app, what sorts of considerations am I going to think of? What sorts of things, if I'm designing a new app that's to help someone track their health and make sure they stay healthy, if I'm a man, what sorts of things do I have to think of? Or what sorts of things will I think of? Or more importantly, what sorts of things might slip my mind? What sorts of things that are major health concerns for half the population that I'm just not going to think of because I'm thinking from my own experience?
Just anything that relates to you, Professor, like anything that relates to you. No, I don't know.
So in the case of this is an actual case when Google's actually no, I think it was Apple. So BMI, these are the sorts of things that everyone is immediately going to think of. BMI. Now, I don't want to put anyone who identifies as a woman on the spot, so I'm not going to like force you to give me an answer. But if anyone wants to volunteer, can anyone guess what major health issue that affects about 51% of the population at some point in their life was actually ignored from the first version of Apple Health?
Oh no, the women's their period, right?
Yeah.
Was it?
Menstruation
Oh,
was
menstruation.
not on the first version of this health app, where for 51% of the population, that's just like, what is the point of this app? That is a major thing. So while yes, it's a health app that you might say like is still going to be useful for everyone, it's clearly designed for men by men who were not taking into account something which is very important for women's health. So here was a way in which the statistics of these companies had a direct impact on these sorts of, if you were a woman interested in taking care of your own health, it was harder for you because there was a large part of your health that was not going to be able to be tracked by this app. Like the app was not going to cover an important health consideration because it was designed by men who were thinking about men. Another way to think of this is, and to be clear, it's not like these men were like, well, screw all women, we're not going to consider them. It was rather, it's just like, people can be dumb about things that aren't concerned with themselves, or they'll just think like, I'm not qualified to design this, and no one here is because we're mostly men. And what ends up happening is considerations just get ignored. What are some other impacts, downstream effects that this is going to have? What are some other things? How many people play video games?
I do, and basically there's a lot of supposedly people are like, I guess not supposedly, but there are a lot of misrepresentation as a woman. But at the same time, like it's because like people are claiming that it's because men are usually like the people who make the games.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. I had a student a few semesters ago who was a video game designer. That's what he did. And when I brought up the fact, like, it's changing now, and there are more, in the past 5 years, there have been more and more games with female protagonists. But up until very recently, the vast majority of video game protagonists, just like the vast majority of movie protagonists, were men. And he made clear the main reason in his own studio that they do this is not because of the fact that they were trying to make this game for men. It's rather that most of the writers were men and thus didn't feel comfortable trying to write a female character in because they didn't feel comfortable because they did not know what it was like to be a woman and therefore didn't want that to try to project upon others the experience of being a woman when they had never had that experience. But the consequence of that was suddenly you had games where the vast majority of the protagonists were men. Jorge.
Yeah, Professor. Also, they go to the other extreme where they only or almost always present women and a very sexualized person.
That's another issue. Is games, if you look at video game characters who are men, they're generally fully clothed, or maybe they have their shirt off, but that's about it. Compare that with female video game characters, and they are almost always hypersexualized in a way that is very, if you pause and think about it, is just straight up distasteful. Jorge.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say same thing. Like a man is, you see the male characters are like boring looking, you know,
Yeah,
and the female are like you said, like over sexualized.
it's hypersexualized. They generally, like if you look at old video games from the 90s, like fighting games, the outfits that the female characters are put in are just like truly like to call them a bikini is to be exaggerating. It's basically just like naked women and fully clothed men. So what this ends up doing is creating these sorts of narratives. So one thing this does is it leads to games that are straight up just like, one of the reasons that there are few women playing video games compared to men is that the games for a long time did not feel like they were designed for women. And so because of the fact that they weren't designed for women, what are some of the downstream effects this had? What ended up happening with these mostly male player-based games? And this is something I think I brought up a few classes ago. If you go online and play an online game, what ends up happening very quickly?
A lot of slurs.
A lot of slurs and a lot of sexism. So what ended up happening is because the games were made by men, catered toward men, you ended up with a very large male player base, which has now almost created this self-fulfilling prophecy of it ends up causing women to not want to be in the game or not want to partake in this sort of environment, which then makes the player base more and more male. And not only is this like a negative thing for the society as a whole, where women are missing out on a possible method of enjoyment, it's also a problem for the video game designers. What is the problem for video game designers if your games are only being purchased by men?
It's a lot of there's a lot of backlash from women because like if you create a game with no females, like even even if you wanted just to do that, say like, oh, because like it might have been easier, it might have made more sense. They always want there should be female representation.
So part of it is that, but let's like put that aside. Imagine even if there was no backlash, what's the issue?
Professor, also like because there is like your game is successful, you might just keep going in that direction.
So another thing is if your game's successful, you're going to keep going in that direction. It's going to reinforce. So we've got this sort of, again, self-fulfilling prophecy of sexism leads to male player base, which leads to more sexism. But what's just like the straight up economic issue of only having men play your game? What is the straight up economics?
You lose out on potential customers.
50% of the population is not interested in buying your product because your product is not geared towards them. So if you're a video game designer, you're also losing out on potential revenue. So it's not just that it's hurting the society and that you have it, and it's not just that it's hurting the women, even the company themselves is being hurt by this level of self-fulfilling prophecy. Another sort of thing is that it also creates this image of the sorts of people who, and it creates, remember we were talking before about that sort of pipeline effect, where why is it that there are so few people of color in tech? And why are there so few women in tech? Well, part of the reason is because there are fewer women and people of color applying for tech jobs in the first place. And part of the reason for that is historical economics and historical the economics of getting education and things like that. But what's another main reason? Like, look at the names on this board right now. This is actually a rather mixed gender group, but we still have more men than women in this class. Why is that the case? What is it that has led to the fact that there are more men in a computer science class than there are women?
Usually stereotypes of computer scientists being a man's job, and like women shouldn't like really interfere with that. That's what I think the stereotype is. But
yeah, there's this image
like those hiring practices have a lot to do with it. You won't go into like a career where you're not gonna be taken seriously.
And here's an issue, and this is where the self-fulfilling prophecy comes in. If you see only 23% of women at Google, then you, in your mind, think, well, Google's for men. Then because of this, you start thinking things like, this sort of person, they seem like a Google employee. They seem like somebody who belongs here. They would fit with our culture. And what that ends up doing is just, you think fit with our culture, but what can end up happening is that ends up meaning male. And so now Google's culture is defined as male. So if you're a woman who is, or let's go even more, if you're a little girl who really you find computers fascinating, you're into technology, you're really interested in this sort of stuff, your dad shows you your first computer as a child, and you really want to learn how they work and spend your life with them. Well, what ends up happening the moment you start getting old enough to want to play video games or want to do computer programming?
It's discouraging, Professor, when you
Yeah,
encounter basically like a men's world, and you're, I guess,
and like,
you don't feel represented.
and even
But
down to like, I want to put on the table right now, I am very aware of like, I'm up here in front of you all, standing here as somebody who identifies as a white man, talking about all these sorts of things. And the very fact that I'm up here in this position talking to you all is undoubtedly partly the fact that I did not face the challenges of like somebody who talks to a group of people like it is and expects to be in a position. Like, there was no part of me that had to go, you know what, professors don't look like me, or professors aren't the same gender as me. So I did not face, and so like even now talking in this way, I'm very aware of the way in which I was not blocked by my own expectations of what somebody who's doing this should look like. Well, if you are somebody who doesn't fit the group, that is there's this added hardship and I'm sure those of you who are women in tech have dealt with this stuff. You've had a male coworker or a co-presenter who ignored you because for the simple fact that you're a woman. And I'm sure if you're a person of color, you have felt that experience of applying for a tech job and being the only person who is the non-white person applying for the job, or you go in the office and you realize you look different. So in some sense, there's something deeply ironic or deeply troubling about the fact that I'm up here talking to you all about something that you are all probably more aware of than I am from a first person living perspective. But the thing I do want to highlight is even like, so on this one hand, I'm not as familiar with these things, but on the other hand, I want to highlight just like the downstream effects that these things have for companies and for society as a whole. Because oftentimes people will recognize like, oh yes, it sucks to be a woman playing an online video game. But very often people don't pause and talk about the consequence. So while on the one hand, it's quite unfortunate that I'm the one up here talking to you all about it because I have not lived these things. On the other hand, I happen to be the one given my benefits to be up here. And while I understand all the benefits I had that got me to this place, there's also something where I feel like it has to be talked about due to all the effects that these sorts of things have. Jorge, you wanted to say something.
no, yeah, Professor, no, you touch on something very important, because is I think is crucial for you to see like that person in that position that you want to be and that looks like you. It gives you that extra like push that is possible for you to accomplish. So
Yeah.
that's actually a good like a variable,
Yeah, and I think this is a thing of like one of the reasons, like you grow up and you want to be like somebody else. Like kids get heroes when they're young. And very often, like as a boy, my heroes were mostly boys. And as a girl, your heroes are mostly girls. So if you see somebody who is in technology and all of a sudden you see the only people in that field are, or if the only people who are in that field are men, if you're a girl, you're not going to feel that connection. I for one, know that there were certain things where like the fact that I didn't see many men in it made me less interested because of just the way that the child brain works and the ways in which we are, brought up from a young age of this is what men do and this is what women do. And so what ends up happening is the fact that there's a low percentage ends up feeding back into the very system which led to this low percentage, and it becomes very difficult to break out of. And so this is why we are seeing a lot of movements these days of things like women in STEM, of trying to push and highlight that the women are just as belonging in these fields as men are, to try to offset this long history. And another reason that it's very difficult is because of what Jorge was saying before with implicit racism and implicit sexism and implicit attitudes. we as a species very often just assume that if something's a certain way, there must be some essence or reason it's this way. So the most classic case of this is if you went back to like the 19th century. In the 19th century, that was like the core of colonialism, where Europeans were ruling the whole world and had colonies everywhere. If you actually read the work of Europeans, what was their explanation for why it was that white people ruled everything? If you go back and read their histories, what was their explanation they told themselves?
From what I remember, Professor, is that they were actually, oh man, I forgot. They deserve it because they were the more advanced race, I think it was.
Yeah, white people came to the consideration that white people were smarter, faster, better, all this complete nonsense. But the reason why is because we as a species, we look at something and assume that there's something about its essence or its core that made it that way. It's much harder for us to imagine the long history of random occurrences that led to this point. Like, why was it that the Americans or the Europeans came and were able to push out the Native Americans? Well, in their own mind, it's because they were better and more advanced, when in truth, it had a lot to do with random occurrences and disease and various who happened to have gunpowder. So in this way, we as a species cannot help but think like, oh, there must be something about the people themselves, their core, which made it this way. So if you're somebody looking at only 23% of the people in tech are women, then people start looking and thinking, oh, it must be something about the essence of womanhood that makes them less good at tech, which is complete bullshit. But of course, that's the way that our minds work. So just bringing this stuff up can also help us in our own lives remember, like, don't just look at these statistics and jump to the simplest conclusions. And we can see, like, there's one thing to take away from this unit. It's really that at the end of the day, this is a very complex, thorny issue around inequality and tech. But what tech has not done is made the sorts of inequalities go away. They are here and they've shifted, but they're just as complicated, and in some ways getting more complicated, more nuanced, more intertwined, and much. But the other issue is, in a lot of ways, these sorts of things are harder to recognize than ever before, just because as technology spreads and the world gets more complicated, it's harder to identify these sorts of implicit biases in our systems. Does anyone have anything else they want to say about any like personal experiences they want to share? No pressure on anybody, or anything about any of these sorts of inequality things in tech that we've talked about today. If anybody wants to say anything, because the fact is, like, tech is a very unequal place on many levels.
I can't think of anything right now.
And again, if anything came up today, I'm very aware that there's like something deeply troubling about me being the one talking. So if I said anything offensive today or anything, I'm very sorry. And if anyone wants to talk to me about any of this stuff at any point, feel free. Any other questions, comments, concerns on any of these things? There will be paper topics for paper 2 on this, of like, is the world making, is tech, is the sex ratios in tech, or the race ratios in tech, is that a problem? Why is it a problem? What should be done about it? These are all things. So if these things interest you, you have paper topics you can talk about on them. Any last comments, questions, concerns anyone wants to raise? For those of you who came late, I have graded the papers, but I like to go over them all one last time just to make sure I made no major mistakes on my grading. I don't, every once in a while, I write down the wrong grade or I forget to put it in the grade book. So I just want to run over it once more, but they're all graded. So you'll get them back some point tomorrow. Also, my John Jay Zoom is finally working again. So I will post these videos. For some reason, did anyone else have a problem last weekend where just like John Jay's website was down? Just like completely offline?
Oh, actually, they sent out an email a little bit before, saying that there's going to be maintenance this past weekend.
That
It
makes
was like
sense.
going to be like from like 2 to 6 p.m. or something,
Okay,
like
that
2
makes-
p.m. Saturday to 6 p.m. Sunday or something.
That makes sense then. All right, any last questions, comments, concerns, everybody? All right, in that case, I'm gonna stop the recording and look out the window and see whether I should tell you all to try to get